A great pleasure to be here. Last Thursday, I had breakfast in New York with Andy Smith, whom some of you will know has been, since the late 80s, the leading intellect deployed on the bearish side of the gold argument. He is a man of considerable intellectual ability and great information, and I always felt it was unwise to neglect what he had to say. He was with UBS and subsequently with Mitsui, and he's now seen the light and left to join a hedge fund. Towards the middle of the breakfast, Andy, whom I've known quite some years on a personal level, leaned back on his chair and said, "You know, it's just amazing what Bill Murphy and the Garter people have been able to do." And he particularly referred to the work of Reg Howe on the discovery of the gold derivatives data in the National Control of the Currency and the BIS documents, which I do not believe was widely known by the bullion bankers themselves when it was surfaced. I mention this because I think we all owe Bill Murphy and Chris Powell a tremendous debt. I had been suffering in the gold world for close to 20 years when they both surfaced, and it's amazing to me that two men from outside could come in, tell us the potential of the internet, and inject into the situation the moral fervor and indeed the sense of outrage which has enabled so much to be done. I'm very used, in my profession as a stockbroker on Wall Street, to having people sneer at Bill Murphy's effervescence and enthusiasm, and also, I must say, at Chris Powell's automatic use of mass communication and populist approach to disseminating economic arguments. And indeed, they do have a quintessentially American approach to the world, which the rest of the English-speaking world, to say nothing of everywhere else, sometimes find quite odd. But the simple fact of the matter is that without the Garter, the Metropole platform, and the fury that makes Billy get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and start looking at his email and start concocting his arrows for the day, the work of Frank Venerosa would have been forgotten. Reg Howe, and even prominent investment people like John Embry, John Hathaway's work would not have been as widely disseminated as it was. I wouldn't be able to get my occasional stones off. And I really don't believe the curtailment of hedging amongst the mining industry would have happened as rapidly as it did. It's a long time ago now, but the fact is it was Bill's furious bombardment of these miners whenever they had the temerity to assemble at a conference with hundreds of emails from his troops about what they thought about hedging, that I really do think chilled that iniquitous trade and has driven people like Andy Smith, who made their living out of promoting the lending and selling of gold, out of the bullion banking business. So Alfield says we don't need as acrimonious as an approach. We need to be more oriented towards education. I don't think that's what gets people out of bed in the morning. As Rumsfeld said, you have to fight an army with the troops that you have to fight a war with the army that you have. And if this is what gets these men working, then I say more strength to them. Some 10 to 15 years ago, a book was published, which some of you may have worked your way through, I'm sure Professor Vanecke has, called Golden Fetters by an economics professor called Barry Eichengreen. It's still in print. It was published by the Yale University Press. If you read the title and the blurb of this book, you would get the impression that it was an exposition of how the gold standard caused the Great Depression. This is entirely incorrect. Eichengreen rapidly disposes of this theory in his book by simply observing that the gold standard, or more accurately, the gold exchange standard, did not have the chance to work in the 20s and the 30s because power had shifted from the governments that were willing to put up with its disciplines, that basically means the British, to, on the one hand, the Federal Reserve, very new entity in those days, and on the other hand, even worse, the French, neither of whom were willing to put up with the disciplines of anything resembling the gold standard. The rest of Eichengreen's book I have found very illuminating. It's essentially a huge, prolonged celebration of the power of central bankers. A long discussion of what they did right and what they did wrong, mainly wrong, in the 20s and the 30s, and the speculation of what they could have done if they'd been better informed, for instance, by economics professors like Barry Eichengreen. I might add that buried in the footnotes there makes an appearance, two appearances in fact, Ben Bernanke, at that time a PhD student at, I think, Princeton. I found this very illuminating. It's a commonplace that armies in their general staffs have men who sit and spend years and years contemplating how to fight just about every country in the world, or on weekends for a change, how to defend just about every country in the world. We all know there are men who spend their entire lives contemplating pro-football or something like that. The reality is there appear to be men in universities, in economic think tanks, in central banks, who spend their entire lives contemplating, worshipping, drooling over the power that a central banker has and what can be done with it. This is a pretty frightening experience, a thing to realize. In the year or so after 9/11, when it became clear that American foreign policy had been seized by this curious group known as neoconservatives, a considerable amount was written about the obscure, now dead, thank goodness, professor from Chicago, Leo Strauss, and his Straussian approach to public affairs. Strauss propounded the view that the world should be run for the good of itself, not to say, as interpreted by an aristocracy, which could communicate with itself by its own arcane language and manipulate what you might call the peasantry by using other symbols. There are far simpler explanations to how the neoconservatives tick, but it seems to me with central banks, this is the phenomenon we've got. They get together in these interminably frequent conferences in all kinds of expensive resorts, have these long weekends, 4 or 5 day meetings, issue completely opaque communiques, and then go home and do it again 3 months later. What are they all talking about? Why do they need to see each other so often? What does it mean for us? Well, I think for those of us who, by accident or design, got involved in the gold market, it means very, very bad news. As Reg has already pointed out, something very funny happened in the gold market. At the very least, one could say, in the 96-98 collapse. And it certainly became clear in the 99 Washington Agreement and its very strange aftermath that the central bankers were in this thing very deep. So they've done something. The issue is, and they've done it to us. The issue is, I guess, why? Now, the first thing, I'm personally not terribly interested in economics. My interest in is history. And if you analyze public policy, you rapidly realize that a given public policy can be put into effect because several different parties or entities in the state see different things in it for themselves. And one thing that came to mind was when I read this very strange paper that's up, I believe, on the BIS website about the Swiss National Bank gold sale. The Swiss National Bank gold sale went on at a ton a day, every day, for over 5 years. I guess it was actually about 8 years, wasn't it? 7 years? In any case, the Office of the Swiss National Bank, in a very long paper, patting himself on the back very extensively, reveals the curious fact that the dealers at the Swiss National Bank had the right, were given the mandate to buy back as much as 2/3 of the gold they sold on any given day in order to so-called stabilize the market. Now, this is crazy. A ton a day of gold at its most was, what, $13–14 million? I've seen equity desks, big equity pools, where the traders have got out of control and seized control of the flow of orders, and all kinds of funny things done, many of them very inefficient. But I've never seen anybody with a sell order for just $15 million worth of stock buy back 2/3 of it in a day. One possible explanation is that they simply enjoyed doing it. It's a lot more fun screaming down the phone, being taken out to drinks afterwards. Who knows, maybe next year they'll have a conference in Dawson City, than just staring at a pile of gold gathering dust in the basement. It's a sort of rent-seeking approach. That is one way of looking at it, and I'm sure there's an element of it, but unfortunately one has to reject it. Incidentally, I forgot the punchline. I was so busy thinking about Billy, I forgot the punchline. I called New York a little while ago, and open interest has just come out. Open interest on the COMEX rose 29.5 tons on Friday, which is a matter of 9,602 contracts. This means that open interest has risen in 3 days, a matter of 125 tons, or about 40,000 contracts, or about 15% of outstanding open interest, for a gold price increase of about $5. Gold was down $2.60 today, by the way. Oil was up $1.35 to a new high. In other words, the seller is still out there. This isn't happening by magic. There is a seller out there who sells, and it's extremely annoying. Anyway, on Billy's site, and I guess if you Google on LTCM and my name, you'll find 2 essays on the issue of LTCM capital management and its collapse, which Billy has already referred to. But I think that event is a tremendous window into the functioning of the late Clinton administration, and indeed of Washington and the central banking function generally. The first point to make is that all the people who got together and rushed in to save this thing, no one thought that the losses from the LTCM debacle could exceed $5 or $6 billion. In contrast to Enron, where the class action lawyer said the other day that the damage may be $50 billion. So the issue is, why did they rush in to save it? Well, the 2 essays I wrote are based on 2 exceptionally good books, quite different books. Inventing Money by Lowenstein, and what the hell was the one called? But anyway, Dunbar, the other was... but they miss out one particularly important piece of information. In the aftermath, the Financial Times carried an article, which was a leak from the UBS credit department. UBS, of course, had lost almost a huge fortune with LTCM, and in fact, it made a major contribution to UBS going out of business, forced merger. The credit department said, well, it's true that we're lending money to this outfit far in excess of our normal norms and on a superficially or in a reckless manner. However, 32% of the equity of LTCM is held by generally government-owned banks who are in a position to furnish it with sensitive information from their national markets. This is in cold blood in print. Admittedly, they didn't expect to hit the newspaper. In other words, the LTCM had figured out a method of inveigling government-owned entities to give them inside information. And in fact, when you read the Dunbar book on this, you find that this is in fact exactly what happens, particularly in the case of Italy. The Italians are the central bank that was most surfaced as being involved with LTCM. They had, I think it was $100 million invested, and they had a couple $100 million credit line. It materializes that LTCM had in effect been hired to manipulate the Italian bond market. To that end, they were being allowed to corner the auctions and stuff it down the throats of the unfortunate Italian SNLs. That way they have it of just putting in a market at fill bid in these things. With the Italian government not only turning a blind eye, but actually having the insolence to censor Credit Suisse in the middle of this because they tried to do a similar thing. About half LTCM's profits came from this maneuver. which incidentally was basically unhedged, contrary to all the things you hear about hedging with this crowd. Now, I think this is a big insight into why LTCM was rescued. And I used to think that it was mainly because it's maybe only $5 billion, but it's a question of whose $5 billion. And quite a lot of the $5 billion belong to Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, who are in a position to make their voice heard in Washington. That's what I used to think when I first read the book. But thinking it over, it seems clear to me that that may have been why they were able to get action. But the main reason for rescuing LTCM was that the Federal Reserve did not want embarrassment to surface on the front page of newspapers in various other countries who had also hired LTCM to do various things. The Italian objective, by the way, was to converge the Italian bond market with a Bund market so that it could go into the euro. Those are public policy means. And I thought about this more when I read the detailed discussion as to the negotiations to rescue LTCM, which were several times almost wrecked by the representative of Goldman Sachs, who, through constant fits demanding special treatment for his clients, he's a lawyer, needless to say, special hardships for the LTCM partners, all kinds of problems like this, constantly bringing negotiations to the point of breakdown, generally getting his way. Meantime, Goldman Sachs has lost $1 billion that August, had to suspend its public offering, and ultimately kicked their chief executive, John Corzine, upstairs to the US Senate. So and this was a partnership. At those days, Goldman was a partnership. So it was the partners' money that was at risk in this situation. Why were they so confident that they could play Russian roulette like this? Clearly, they knew that the Federal Reserve was going to force a settlement. And not to help them, I don't think. And they knew it because the Federal Reserve didn't want to embarrass its Straussian colleagues in foreign central banks. In other words, I play down the rent-seeking self-aggrandizement theory as a motivation as to why the central banks are behaving like this. I think, very sadly, we have to consider the possibility of cupidity, that decisions have been made in public policies, and I guess Catherine Austin-Fitch will not be surprised to hear this. Public policy decisions have been made by parties in a position to make them stick for personal gain. The explanation as to why gold was forced down in the 96-98 period after a 3-year sideways move, I think Reg put his finger on it this morning when he said the result was to bring rates down and trigger a tremendous financial asset boom. If you were in a position to know that, what a fortune you could have made. And let us say, this is an era when AIG, at one time a significant force in the gold market, turns out to have been falsifying its balance sheets, who knows how much, but enough to destroy the career of its very powerful chief executive. And these Enron settlements, I think, are incredible. I mean, it looks as if we might have a dozen major banks coughing up $20 or $30 billion for assisting an entity in fraud. Andy Smith, incidentally, who's a great enemy of derivatives, and well, I was going to say he won't mind now, but told me the delicious story that when LTCM bought a warrant from when UBS bought a huge capital injection to LTCM on certain terms, the LTCM boys immediately turned around and shorted UBS stock because they thought anybody who was stupid enough to do a deal this bad should short their equity, and which since it worked, by the way. His argument is that, and one of the reasons why he's getting out to the sell side in the investment business, is that the compensation structure of these big investment banks is that you're a salesman selling these derivatives. If you do 3 or 4 years worth of deals, you're an exceptionally wealthy man and you can leave. Meantime, the senior executives in general don't understand what you're doing. And I think that it's all too plausible. So where does this leave us, other than the fact that we've basically, at least many of us have wasted the best part of 10 years of our lives waiting for the gold market to move? Well, the central banks have a very serious problem. And that problem is the physical market. The gold market is totally restructured in the last 15 or 20 years. It's not widely known, but the central banks agreed in 74 not to increase in aggregate their gold holdings. That essentially took them out of the buy side of the gold market. And then at various points, of course, they've been selling at a stepped-out pace. The whole market, and needless to say, Western investment demand has been hammered into the ground. The market has moved to the Middle East and India. I discount China. I think China's a relatively small factor. But it is true in Southeast Asia there's a fair amount of buying. And this is actually a tremendous vindication of the original Frank Vineroso wealth effect theory, which was developed in '91 and cost us all a great deal of money. Because he focused it on China. But it turns out India is the driving force. And beyond that, it's perfectly clear that something funny is happening in the Middle East. The Middle Easterners are buying gold at an extraordinary pace. You almost get the impression they think someone's going to drop a bomb on them. What this essentially means is that the central banks have a tiger by the ears, because these people out there will not be satisfied with by anything except physical. It is simply a question of when they run out. At that point, there's going to be enormous fortune-making inflection in the gold market, and I hope some of us are still alive to appreciate it. One slightly bright note, though. Reg is quite correct, and Smith, in fact, confirmed this. It appears that there's been enormous selling of options by the central banks. This seems to be their method of choice to hold the stuff down right now. So it may be that the cutting into the physical holding has gone even further than some of us thought. This last bout of selling, is no mean thing. If you add it up, it's substantial. So as I say, I think we're entitled to look upon the last decade with a sense of considerable outrage. We were robbed. And we were robbed by central bankers doing something in secret without telling us, which isn't, as the English say, cricket. On the other hand, the cheering thing is they got into this thinking that they could sell 100, 200 tons a year for the next 100 years and then worry about it. It turns out, in fact, they're having to ship out, who knows, 5, 8, 10% of their remaining stock, perhaps even more, in physical form, plus what they're having to sell in the option market to deal with the occasional forays of the hedge funds. So it's later in the day than everybody thinks. Thank you.